In the dust-blown frontier town of Esperanza, they called in Gentle Jim behind his back, their voices dripping with mockery. The shopkeepers would shake their heads when he passed, the saloon girls would giggle, and even the local sheriff would roll his eyes. Here was a man who wouldn't swat a fly, who'd rather walk away from a fight than throw a punch, who spoke to his horse in whispers and treated every stranger like a long-lost friend. But what they didn't know, what none of them could possibly imagine, was that this quiet, unassuming cowboy had earned something no white man in the territory had ever achieved: the sacred trust and unwavering loyalty of 77 Apache warriors. Men who had faced cavalry charges without flinching, who had survived in the harshest desert for generations, who had never bowed to any outsider, now called him Brother of the Wind. The town was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous man is the one everyone thinks is harmless. Sometimes the gentlest soul commands the fiercest protection. And, sometimes, when the wolves come howling at your door, salvation arrives not in the form you expect, but in the bonds forged through understanding, respect, and an unbreakable code of honor that transcends race and prejudice. This is the true story of how Esperanza discovered that they had been living among a legend, and how one man's quiet strength would determine whether their town survived or became another forgotten grave in the unforgiving American West. James McKenna arrived in Esperanza on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1883, riding a gentle mare with saddlebags that looked like they had seen better decades. The town watched him from behind curtains and over coffee cups as he made his way down the main street at a pace that suggested he had all the time in the world. His clothes were clean but well worn, his hat pulled low but not in the threatening manner of a gunslinger. Everything about him whispered ordinary, unremarkable, forgettable. The first thing people noticed was how he talked to his horse. Not the usual commands and curses that filled the air around the livery stable, but actual conversation, as if the mare might answer back with her own thoughts on the weather or the quality of the local grass. Mrs. Henderson, hanging laundry behind the general store, paused in her work to listen as James McKenna told his horse about the beautiful morning and how he hoped they would find good people in this town. "Well, I'll be," she muttered to herself, shaking her head. "Man talks to animals like they're his Sunday congregation." The second thing they noticed was how he handled himself at Murphy's saloon. 3 local ranch hands, flush with payday money and Saturday night courage, decided to test the newcomer. They surrounded his table where he sat quietly eating a bowl of stew and drinking coffee instead of whiskey. "Hey there, stranger," called out Big Pete Morrison, a man whose reputation for bar fights extended 3 counties in every direction. "You look a little soft for these parts. Maybe you'd be more comfortable back east where they powder their noses and drink tea with their pinkies up." The entire saloon fell silent. This was the moment when a man either proved his worth or got run out of town before sunrise. Every eye was on James McKenna, waiting to see if he would reach for the gun on his hip or start throwing punches. Instead, he looked up from his stew with eyes that seemed genuinely curious rather than offended. "You know, Pete," he said, somehow knowing the big man's name though no introductions had been made, "I appreciate the concern. Really, I do. But I think I'll stick around a while if that's all right with everyone. This is good stew, and Mrs. Garcia who made it told me her grandmother's recipe came all the way from Mexico. Seems a shame to waste it over hurt feelings." Big Pete's face reddened. His friends snickered, not with him but at him, which only made things worse. "Hurt feelings?" Pete's voice rose dangerously. "Nobody's got hurt feelings here, soft man. We just like to know what kind of people we're sharing our town with. Some folks think they can just ride in and act better than everyone else." James McKenna nodded thoughtfully and took another spoonful of stew. "I can understand that," he said. "Community is important. Trust is important. A man should know his neighbors and his neighbors should know him. Maybe I can buy you fellows a round of drinks and we can get properly acquainted." This response confused everyone present. It wasn't submission exactly, but it wasn't confrontation either. It was something else entirely, something that seemed to diffuse the tension while somehow making Big Pete look foolish for pushing the matter. "I don't want your charity drinks," Pete snarled, but his heart wasn't really in it anymore. The moment had shifted away from him somehow, and he couldn't figure out how to get it back. "Not charity," James replied with a slight smile. "Just neighborly. Where I come from, sharing a drink with new folks is how we show respect." And that was how James McKenna established himself in Esperanza. Not through violence or intimidation, not by backing down or running away, but by treating aggression like a misunderstanding that could be resolved with patience and good intentions. It drove the town troublemakers crazy because they couldn't quite figure out how to pick a fight with someone who refused to fight back but somehow never seemed beaten either. Over the following weeks, James found work as a handyman and part-time ranch hand, taking whatever jobs needed doing without complaint about the pay or the working conditions. He fixed Mrs. Patterson's broken porch steps and wouldn't accept payment beyond a glass of lemonade and a slice of her famous apple pie. He helped old Tom Bradley round up his scattered cattle when they broke through a fence during a thunderstorm, working from dawn until dark in the mud and rain, and when Tom tried to pay him, James said the experience was payment enough because he learned something about Tom's land and his cattle that might be useful someday. The town began to develop theories about their strange new resident. Some folks thought he might be running from something, maybe the law or an angry husband or gambling debts. Others figured he was just simple in the head, too dumb to understand when he was being insulted or threatened. A few suspected he might be one of those religious fanatics who believed in turning the other cheek no matter what happened to the first one. But Martha Williams, who owned the boarding house where James rented a small room, noticed things that others missed. She saw how he sometimes disappeared for days at a time with no explanation, always heading west toward the desert where the Apache were said to roam. She noticed that he never seemed surprised by anything, as if he already knew what was coming before it happened. Most curious of all, she observed that while James McKenna appeared gentle and harmless to everyone in town, there was something in his eyes when he thought no one was looking, something that suggested depths and experiences far beyond what his quiet demeanor revealed. The truth about James McKenna began to emerge on a hot afternoon in July when young Billy Henderson got himself into serious trouble. The boy, barely 16 and full of the kind of courage that comes from inexperience, had been hunting rabbits in the foothills when he stumbled across what he thought was an abandoned Apache camp. Excited by the possibility of finding arrowheads or other treasures, Billy started poking around the seemingly empty site. What he didn't realize was that the camp wasn't abandoned at all. 3 Apache warriors had been resting in the shade of nearby rocks, and they didn't appreciate having their privacy invaded by a clumsy white boy who knocked over their water vessels and scattered their carefully banked fire. By the time Billy understood his mistake, he was surrounded by 3 very unhappy Apache warriors who were having a heated discussion in their own language about what to do with him. Billy might have been young and foolish, but he wasn't stupid. He could read the tone of their voices and the expressions on their faces well enough to know that his situation was extremely dangerous. The rescue party that formed in Esperanza was typical of the town's approach to Apache troubles: 12 heavily armed men who planned to ride out in force, surround the Apache, and demand the return of the boy while making it clear that any harm to Billy would result in severe consequences for the entire Apache band. Sheriff Davis was organizing this expedition when James McKenna quietly approached him outside the jail. "Sheriff," he said in his usual calm voice, "I wonder if you might consider letting me try a different approach first." Davis looked at him with the kind of expression usually reserved for someone who had just suggested jumping off a cliff. "McKenna, this is serious business. We're talking about Apache warriors here, not some disagreement over cattle or water rights. These people don't negotiate. They don't respond to pretty words and good intentions. They understand strength and nothing else." "Maybe," James replied. "But maybe not. What if I rode out alone and tried talking to them? If it doesn't work, you can still go ahead with your plan. But if it does work, you might save Billy's life and avoid a fight that could get a lot of people killed." The crowd that had gathered around the sheriff erupted in laughter and disbelief. The idea of Gentle Jim McKenna riding alone into an Apache camp to negotiate the release of a hostage struck everyone as the height of foolishness. "McKenna," said Big Pete Morrison, who had become something of an unofficial spokesman for the town's skeptics, "those Apache will gut you like a fish before you can say your first pretty please. And then, we'll have to rescue 2 people instead of 1. But Sheriff Davis found himself considering the proposal. James McKenna was an odd duck, no question about that, but there was something about him that suggested he wasn't quite as naive as he appeared. And the truth was, Davis had seen what happened when posses went up against Apache warriors. Even when the white men won, they usually paid a heavy price in blood. "All right, McKenna," the sheriff said finally. "You can try it your way. But, you get 1 hour. If you're not back with the boy by then, we come in shooting." James nodded and walked toward the livery stable to saddle his mare. The crowd watched him go with a mixture of amusement and pity, many of them already composing the story they would tell about how gentle Jim McKenna rode off to his death trying to reason with savages. What happened next would change everything the people of Esperanza thought they knew about their quiet, unassuming neighbor. James McKenna rode west into the desert with the same unhurried pace he used for everything else, but now there was something different about him. The closer he got to the Apache camp, the more he seemed to shed his role as the town's harmless eccentric and become something else entirely. His posture straightened, his eyes sharpened, and, when he finally dismounted near the rocks where Billy Henderson was being held, he moved with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The 3 Apache warriors emerged from the shade to confront this lone white man who had dared to approach their camp. They held their weapons ready but did not immediately attack, partly out of curiosity about anyone foolish enough to come alone and partly because there was something about this particular white man that gave them pause. James McKenna looked at each of the 3 warriors in turn, and then he did something that stunned everyone present, including young Billy Henderson. He spoke to them in their own language. Not the few broken words that some traders and soldiers picked up, but fluent, respectful Apache that showed deep understanding of their customs and beliefs. He addressed the eldest of the 3 warriors by name and with the proper forms of respect due to a man of his standing in the tribe. "Nailish, my friend," James said, using the Apache word for my relative that indicated a relationship of trust and mutual respect. "I come seeking your wisdom and your mercy for this foolish boy who has disturbed your rest." The 3 Apache warriors exchanged glances of amazement. How did this white man know Nailnish's name? How had he learned to speak their language so perfectly? And why was he using the formal terms that indicated he considered himself bound to them by ties of kinship and honor? The conversation that followed was conducted entirely in Apache, leaving Billy Henderson completely mystified about what was being negotiated on his behalf. But, gradually, the tone of the discussion became less threatening and more like a conversation between old friends who were working together to solve a problem. Finally, Nailnish stepped forward and placed his hand on James McKenna's shoulder in a gesture of respect and affection. "Shash Yazi," he said, using what was clearly a name they had given to James long ago. "You speak wisdom as always. The boy will be returned to his people, but he must learn to show respect for the sacred places of others." James nodded and turned to Billy, switching back to English. "Billy, you need to apologize to these men for disturbing their camp. And you need to promise that you'll be more careful in the future about where you go hunting." Billy, still in shock from hearing his rescuer speaking fluent Apache, managed to stammer out an apology and a promise to stay away from Apache lands. The 3 warriors accepted his words with solemn nods, and then they did something even more surprising. They embraced James McKenna like a brother returning from a long journey. The ride back to Esperanza was conducted in stunned silence. Billy Henderson kept staring at James McKenna as if he had never seen him before, which in many ways was true. The quiet handyman who fixed porches and gentled horses had just demonstrated abilities and connections that suggested a completely different history than anything the town had imagined. When they reached Esperanza, Sheriff Davis and his posse were already mounted and ready to ride out. The sight of James and Billy returning unharmed caused a sensation that brought half the town into the street. "How did you do it?" Sheriff Davis demanded. "How did you get them to release the boy?" James dismounted and helped Billy down from his horse. "I asked them nicely," he said with the same calm demeanor he always displayed. "Turns out they're reasonable people when you treat them with respect." But Billy Henderson wasn't going to let him get away with such a simple explanation. He spoke their language, the boy announced to the crowd. Perfect Apache. And they knew him. They called him by some Indian name and hugged him like family. The crowd fell silent. This revelation changed everything they thought they knew about James McKenna. Gentle Jim, the man they had dismissed as weak and naive, apparently had connections to the Apache that went far deeper than anyone had suspected. "Is that true, McKenna?" Sheriff Davis asked. "Do you know these Apache personally?" James looked around at the faces of his neighbors, reading the suspicion and fear that was beginning to replace their earlier amusement and condescension. This was the moment he had hoped to avoid, but Billy's rescue had made it inevitable. "I know some of them," he admitted. "We've had dealings in the past." "What kind of dealings?" Big Pete Morrison demanded, his voice heavy with suspicion. "The kind that taught me it's better to settle differences with words than with guns," James replied. "The kind that showed me there's more than one way to look at most problems." The crowd was beginning to murmur among themselves, and James could sense the shift in their mood. Fear was a powerful emotion in Apache territory, and the discovery that their town's most harmless resident had secret connections to their most feared enemies was causing a lot of uncomfortable questions. Martha Williams pushed through the crowd to stand beside James. "I don't care who he knows or what language he speaks," she declared loudly. "He brought Billy home safe when the rest of you were planning to start a war. That's good enough for me." Her words helped calm the immediate tension, but James could see that his secret was out and his quiet life in Esperanza was about to become much more complicated. The town now knew that their gentle handyman was not what he appeared to be, and that knowledge would change everything about how they treated him. What they didn't know yet was that the 3 Apache warriors who had released Billy Henderson would carry word of the encounter back to their band, and that this news would soon reach the ears of others who had long wondered what had become of the white man they called Shashyazi, the one who had earned their respect and loyalty through deeds of courage and honor that few of his own people would ever understand. The quiet life of James McKenna in Esperanza was coming to an end, but the legend of the cowboy with the backing of 77 Apache warriors was just beginning. The whispers started the morning after Billy Henderson's rescue and spread through Esperanza like wildfire in dry grass. By noon, every person in town had heard some version of the story about James McKenna speaking fluent Apache and being greeted like family by warriors who would normally shoot a white man on sight. By evening, the stories had grown in the telling until some folks claimed he could summon Apache spirits and others swore they had seen him talking to coyotes in the desert. James went about his usual business, fixing what needed fixing and helping where help was needed, but he could feel the weight of every stare and sensed the sudden silence that fell when he entered a room. The easy acceptance he had enjoyed as the town's harmless eccentric had evaporated overnight, replaced by a mixture of fear, suspicion, and reluctant respect that made every interaction awkward and tense. The questions came gradually, starting with Sheriff Davis, who approached James 3 days after the incident while he was repairing the steps of the church. "McKenna," the sheriff said, settling himself on a nearby stump with the careful movements of a man who wanted to appear casual but was ready for trouble. "I've been thinking about what happened with the Henderson boy, and I'm wondering if maybe you could fill in some of the details you left out." James continued working on the loose board he was nailing down, not looking up from his task. "What details would those be, Sheriff?" "Well, for starters, how exactly does a cowboy from wherever you came from learn to speak Apache like a native? And how do Apache warriors in these parts come to know you well enough to call you by an Indian name and treat you like family?" The question hung in the air between them while James finished securing the board and reached for another nail. When he finally looked up, his eyes held a weariness that suggested this conversation was one he had been dreading but expecting. "It's a long story, Sheriff. And parts of it aren't very pretty." "I've got time for long stories," Davis replied. "And I've seen enough of life to handle the ugly parts." James set down his hammer and sat back on his heels, studying the sheriff's face as if trying to decide how much truth the man could handle. "All right," he said finally. "But I'll warn you, once you hear this story, you might wish I had kept it to myself." "Try me." James was quiet for a long moment, looking out toward the desert hills where the heat was already beginning to dance above the rocks. "5 years ago, I wasn't fixing church steps in quiet frontier towns," he began. "I was riding with the cavalry out of Fort Bowie, hunting Apache bands and trying to force them onto reservations they didn't want and couldn't survive on." Sheriff Davis felt a chill run down his spine despite the afternoon heat. This was not what he had expected to hear. "I was a sergeant then," James continued, "in charge of a patrol unit that was supposed to track down Apache raiders and either capture them or kill them. The army didn't much care which, as long as they stopped causing problems for the settlers and miners who were moving into Apache territory." "What changed?" Davis asked quietly. We got good at our job, James said, and there was a bitterness in his voice that the sheriff had never heard before. Too good, maybe. We tracked down a small band of Apache who had been accused of raiding ranches and stealing cattle. Caught up with them in a canyon where they couldn't escape. He picked up his hammer and turned it over in his hands, studying it as if he had never seen such a tool before. Thing was, when we surrounded them, we found out it wasn't a raiding party at all. It was just families. Old people, women, children. They had some cattle with them, that was true, but they weren't stolen cattle. They were cattle they had traded for with Mexican herders, trying to get enough food to make it through the winter. Sheriff Davis was beginning to understand why James McKenna had seemed so reluctant to tell this story. My commanding officer, Captain Morrison, didn't want to hear explanations. He said Apache were Apache, and if they had cattle in their possession, that was proof enough of guilt. He ordered us to attack. And, did you? James was quiet for so long that Davis began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I tried to. God help me, I tried to follow orders. But, when I saw those children, some of them no older than Billy Henderson, looking up at us with terror in their eyes, something broke inside me. I couldn't do it. I couldn't murder innocent people just because they were Apache. What happened? I told my men to stand down. Said we needed to investigate further before taking action. Captain Morrison went into a rage, started screaming about insubordination and cowardice and how I was betraying my uniform and my race. He drew his sidearm and ordered me to execute the Apache leader or be shot for treason. The church steps were forgotten now. Sheriff Davis found himself leaning forward, completely absorbed in this revelation about the man he had thought he knew. So what did you do? I made a choice, James said simply. I drew my gun and pointed it at Captain Morrison instead of at the Apache. Told my men that anyone who wanted to murder children could go ahead and try, but they would have to go through me first. Jesus, Davis breathed. That was the end of my army career, James continued. Morrison reported me for mutiny, and technically he was right. I had disobeyed a direct order and threatened a superior officer. I was facing a court-martial and probably a firing squad. But you're here instead of in a military prison or a grave. The Apache saved me, James said. The leader of that band, an old man named Cochise's cousin, spoke enough English to understand what was happening. He saw that I was willing to sacrifice my life to protect his people, and that meant something to him. What did he do? He and his warriors created a distraction that allowed me to escape. They could have left me to face the consequences of my choice, but they didn't. They helped me get away from Morrison and his men, and then they took me in. Sheriff Davis was beginning to understand the true scope of what James McKenna was telling him. You lived with them? For almost 2 years, James confirmed. They taught me their language, their customs, their ways of surviving in country that would kill most white men in a matter of days. But, more than that, they showed me a different way of thinking about courage and honor and what it means to be a man. And that's how you learn to speak Apache like a native. That's part of it. But the real education came from understanding their values. The Apache don't respect weakness, but they also don't mistake cruelty for strength. They honor courage, but real courage, not just the willingness to kill people who can't fight back. James stood up and brushed the dust off his knees, looking out toward the desert again. I learned that the Apache way of measuring a man has less to do with how many enemies he can kill and more to do with how he treats people who depend on him for protection. How he keeps his word. How he faces hardship without complaint and shares what he has with those who have less. Is that why the warriors in Billy's camp treated you like family? Word travels fast among the Apache bands. When someone earns their respect, that respect extends to all the related clans and tribes. The name they gave me, Shash Yazi, means little bear. It's not because I'm small, but because they say I have the strength to be gentle when gentleness takes more courage than violence. Sheriff Davis sat in silence for several minutes, trying to absorb everything he had heard. Finally, he looked up at James with an expression that mixed respect with concern.
McKenna, what you're telling me means you're a deserter from the U.S. Army.
That's a serious crime, even 5 years later.
I know that, Sheriff.
I've been living with that knowledge every day since I left that canyon.
Are you wanted? Is there a warrant out for your arrest? James shook his head.
Captain Morrison reported that I was killed in the action. It was easier for him than explaining how his sergeant had turned against him to protect Apache women and children. The Army thinks I'm dead, and I've been careful to keep it that way. But now the whole town knows you have connections to the Apache. It won't be long before that information spreads beyond Esperanza.
I know that too, James said quietly. Which is why I'm telling you the truth.
If word reaches the wrong people, if the Army comes looking for me, at least you'll know why. Sheriff Davis stood up and adjusted his gun belt, thinking hard about what he had learned and what it meant for his town. James, he said finally, using the man's first name for the first time, I appreciate you telling me the truth.
But, I have to ask, if trouble comes to Esperanza, if we face some kind of threat that the town can't handle on its own, would those Apache friends of yours help us? James considered the question carefully before answering.
Sheriff, the Apache have their own problems with the Army and the territorial government.
They're fighting just to survive as a people. I would never ask them to risk their lives for the problems of white settlements. But, if you did ask? If I asked, and if the cause was just, and if they believed it was a matter of honor.
James paused, seeming to weigh each word carefully.
Yes, I believe they would help. But, that's not something I would do lightly.
As if summoned by their conversation about Apache warriors, a cloud of dust appeared on the eastern horizon, moving fast toward Esperanza. Sheriff Davis shaded his eyes and studied the approaching riders, counting at least 8 men on horses that looked like they had been ridden hard for a considerable distance.
Expecting company? James asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected who the riders might be.
No, Davis replied grimly. And, in my experience, unexpected visitors who ride that hard usually bring trouble. The riders proved to be exactly the kind of trouble Sheriff Davis had feared. They were led by a man wearing the uniform of a territorial marshal, and the men following him had the hard, professional look of experienced manhunters. They reined up in front of the sheriff's office in a cloud of dust and horse sweat, and their leader dismounted with the confident swagger of someone accustomed to having his authority respected without question. Sheriff Davis, the marshal called out.
I'm Marshal Garrett from Tucson. I need to speak with you about a matter of territorial security.
Davis walked over to meet the marshal, with James following a few steps behind. The marshal's eyes swept over both men, lingering for a moment on James with the calculating look of someone who made his living sizing up potential threats.
What kind of security matter brings you to Esperanza, Marshal? Davis asked. We've received reports that this town has been in contact with hostile Apache forces.
Specifically, that someone here has been negotiating with Apache warriors without proper authority and possibly providing them with information about military movements and civilian settlements.
Sheriff Davis felt his stomach tighten. The news of Billy Henderson's rescue had obviously traveled farther and faster than he had hoped.
I'm not sure what reports you've been getting, Marshal, but I can assure you that Esperanza is a law-abiding community. We haven't had any significant trouble with Apache in this area.
Is that so?
Marshal Garrett smiled coldly. Then, perhaps you can explain how a young man from this town was rescued from Apache captivity 3 days ago without any shots being fired and without any ransom being paid? The marshal's information was disturbingly accurate, which suggested that someone in Esperanza had been talking to the territorial authorities. Davis glanced around the small crowd that was gathering to watch this confrontation, wondering who might have sent word to Tucson. The boy got lost hunting and was helped by some Apache who found him, Davis said carefully. They returned him safely, which seems like something to be grateful for rather than suspicious about. Apache don't help lost white boys out of the kindness of their hearts, Sheriff. Someone from this town negotiated that release, and I want to know who and how. Marshal Garrett's eyes moved to James, who had been standing quietly throughout this exchange. You look familiar, friend.
Do I know you from somewhere?
I don't believe we've met, James replied calmly.
Maybe not. But I've got a good memory for faces, and yours reminds me of someone. Someone whose description I've seen on wanted posters. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. James stood perfectly still, but Sheriff Davis could see the subtle shift in his posture that suggested he was preparing for whatever might come next. "I think you've got me confused with someone else, Marshal," James said. "I'm just a handyman who fixes things around town." "Maybe so," Garrett replied. "But I think I'll check that out for myself. Boys, I want you to search this town thoroughly. Any man who fits the general description gets questioned individually. And I want to talk to everyone who was involved in this Apache rescue story." As the marshal's men spread out through Esperanza to begin their investigation, James caught Sheriff Davis's eye and gave him an almost imperceptible nod. The message was clear: the time for secrets was over. Whatever was coming next, they would face it with the truth. What neither of them realized was that the arrival of Marshal Garrett and his men had been observed by eyes other than those of Esperanza's citizens. High in the rocks overlooking the town, an Apache scout named Windrunner had been watching the settlement for 3 days, waiting for the right moment to deliver a message to the man the Apache called Shash Yazi. The message was simple but urgent. Trouble was coming from the east, trouble that would require all of James McKenna's friends to stand together if they hoped to survive. The marshal from Tucson was the least of their worries. Behind him, moving slowly but inexorably toward Apache territory and the towns that bordered it, was a force that would test every alliance and every loyalty that James had built during his years in the desert. The war that James McKenna had tried to prevent 5 years ago was finally coming to Esperanza, and this time there would be no avoiding the choice between his two worlds. Marshal Garrett's investigation lasted 3 days, and during those 3 days, Esperanza felt like a town under siege. The marshal's men questioned everyone, searched every building, and made it clear that they suspected the entire community of harboring dangerous secrets. They were particularly interested in James McKenna, whose calm responses to their questions seemed to frustrate them more than outright hostility would have. On the second day, Marshal Garrett cornered James behind the livery stable where he was shoeing horses. "I know who you are," Garrett said without preamble. "It took me a while to place the face, but I remember now. Sergeant James McKenna, reported killed in action near Fort Bowie 5 years ago. Except you weren't killed, were you? You deserted." James continued working on the horse's hoof, not looking up at the marshal. "Sergeant McKenna died in that canyon," he said quietly. "I'm just a man trying to live a peaceful life and help his neighbors when they need it." "Pretty words," Garrett sneered. "But desertion is desertion, no matter how you dress it up. And consorting with hostile Indians is treason, especially for someone who used to wear the uniform. The Apache who helped Billy Henderson weren't hostile. They returned him unharmed when they could have done anything they wanted to him. Because you asked them to. Because they trust you. Because you've been working with them for God knows how long, probably passing information about army movements and settlement locations." James finally looked up, and the marshal took an involuntary step backward. There was something in those eyes that reminded Garrett uncomfortably of the stories he had heard about what Apache warriors looked like just before they attacked. "Marshal," James said very quietly, "you're talking about things you don't understand. The Apache have never needed my help to know where the army is or what the settlements are planning. They've been living in this country for generations while we've been here for barely decades. If they wanted to attack Esperanza, they could do it any time they chose, with or without information from me." "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact. And it's also a fact that they haven't attacked, despite having every reason to do so. Maybe you should ask yourself why that is before you start making accusations about treason." Before Marshal Garrett could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their confrontation. But these weren't more of the marshal's men returning from their search of the surrounding area. These were horses ridden by men who knew how to move fast and quiet across desert terrain, and they were coming from the west. James straightened up immediately, his entire demeanor changing from that of a defensive townsman to something much more alert and dangerous. The marshal noticed the transformation and instinctively reached for his sidearm. "Easy, Marshal," James said without taking his eyes off the approaching dust cloud. "Those aren't hostile Apache." "But they are Apache,"
and how you handle the next few minutes might determine whether anyone in this town lives to see tomorrow."
"What are you talking about?"
"I'm talking about the fact that Windrunner wouldn't risk coming into a town full of white lawmen unless he had news that couldn't wait.
And news that can't wait is usually bad news."
The Apache scout who materialized out of the desert heat looked exactly like what Marshall Garrett had expected from the stories he had heard: lean, hard, and dangerous, with eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. But what the Marshal hadn't expected was the way the Apache greeted James McKenna. Windrunner dismounted and approached James with obvious respect, speaking rapidly in Apache while gesturing toward the east. James listened carefully, asking occasional questions in the same language, his expression growing increasingly grim as the conversation continued. Finally, Windrunner fell silent and waited for James to respond. The entire exchange had lasted less than 5 minutes, but Marshal Garrett could tell from the tension in both men's postures that whatever information had been shared was extremely serious.
James turned to the Marshal with an expression that mixed urgency with resignation.
"Marshal, you and your men need to leave Esperanza immediately.
Right now. Don't stop to pack, don't stop to ask questions, just get on your horses and ride back to Tucson as fast as you can."
"What?" "I'm not going anywhere until I finish my investigation."
"You're under arrest for desertion and treason, McKenna,
and nothing you or your Apache friend can say is going to change that." James looked at the Marshal with something approaching pity. "Colonel Harrison is coming," he said simply.
The name hit Marshal Garrett like a physical blow.
Everyone in the territory knew about Colonel Harrison, the cavalry officer who had made his reputation hunting Apache with methods that made even hardened frontier soldiers uncomfortable. Harrison believed that the only way to deal with the Apache problem was total war, and he had spent the last 3 years proving his point with campaigns that left no Apache settlements standing and no Apache survivors to carry tales to other bands. "Harrison is at Fort Grant," Garrett said, but his voice lacked conviction.
"He's been assigned to patrol duties in the southern sectors."
"Not anymore," James replied. "According to Windrunner, Harrison has been given command of a special expedition with orders to pacify this entire region. He's bringing 200 cavalry, 50 scouts, and enough supplies for an extended campaign. And he's planning to start by making an example of any town that has shown sympathy toward the Apache."
"How could your Apache friend possibly know about classified military movements?"
"Because the Apache have been watching Harrison's column for the past week. They know exactly how many men he has, what weapons they're carrying, and where they're planning to make camp each night. They also know that Harrison has been asking questions about Esperanza and the recent incident with Billy Henderson." Marshal Garrett felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. If Colonel Harrison was really coming to Esperanza with 200 cavalry, the town was in serious trouble. Harrison's idea of pacification usually involved burning everything that might provide comfort or aid to Apache forces, and that would certainly include any settlements suspected of negotiating with hostile tribes. "Even if what you're saying is true," Garrett said, "I can't just abandon a federal investigation because some Apache scout tells scary stories about military movements."
"Then, you'll die here," James said flatly.
"Along with your men and probably most of the people in this town." Windrunner, who had been listening to this exchange with obvious impatience, spoke again to James in rapid Apache.
James nodded and turned back to the Marshal.
"Windrunner says his people can see the smoke from Harrison's cook fires.
They'll be here by tomorrow afternoon at the latest."
The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Davis, who had been drawn by reports of Apache in the town. He took in the scene at a glance, Marshal Garrett looking pale and shaken, James McKenna standing between the Marshal and an Apache warrior as if trying to prevent a confrontation, and tension thick enough to taste.
"Problems?" Davis asked mildly.
"Big ones," James replied.
"Sheriff, you need to start evacuating the town. Get everyone packed up and moving toward the mountains.
They have maybe 18 hours before this place becomes a battlefield."
"Slow down," Davis said. "What's happening?"
James quickly explained what Windrunner had told him about Colonel Harrison's approaching expedition. As he spoke, Sheriff Davis's expression grew increasingly troubled. Like Marshal Garrett, Davis knew Harrison's reputation and understood what the colonel's arrival would mean for Esperanza.
how reliable is this information? Davis asked.
Before James could answer, Windrunner spoke again, this time in heavily accented but understandable English. Colonel Harrison kills Apache children, the scout said simply. He burns Apache homes. He makes war on Apache women. Now he comes to kill anyone who shows mercy to Apache people.
This is not maybe.
This is truth.
Sheriff Davis looked at James, who nodded confirmation.
Windrunner doesn't speak English often, but when he does, you can count on what he says being accurate. Marshal Garrett finally found his voice.
Even if Harrison is coming, evacuating the town isn't going to solve anything.
Where are people supposed to go? How are they supposed to live? You can't just abandon an entire settlement because of military operations in the area. You can if the alternative is having everyone in that settlement killed, James replied.
Sheriff, Harrison isn't coming here to patrol or to maintain order. He's coming here to send a message. The message is that any white community that cooperates with Apache will be treated as enemy territory. And, you know this how? Because I know Harrison.
I served under him before I was transferred to Morrison's unit. The man sees everything in terms of absolute war. In his mind, you're either completely loyal to the campaign against the Apache or you're a traitor who deserves to die with them. Windrunner had been listening to this debate with obvious agitation. Finally, he interrupted by grabbing James's arm and speaking urgently in Apache. When James responded in the same language, the scout shook his head emphatically and spoke again, his voice rising with emotion.
What's he saying? Sheriff Davis asked.
He's saying that time is running out for talk, James replied. His people have been watching Harrison's column, and they're moving faster than expected.
He thinks they might be here by tonight instead of tomorrow afternoon.
As if to emphasize the urgency of the situation, the sound of a horn echoed across the desert from the direction of the town. It was the signal that Mayor Henderson used to call emergency town meetings, and its urgent, repeated blasts suggested that the emergency was immediate and serious. Someone else has spotted them, James said grimly. The four men hurried toward the center of town, where a crowd was already gathering around Mayor Henderson. The mayor was standing on the steps of the general store, holding a telescope and looking more frightened than anyone in Esperanza had ever seen him.
Folks, Henderson called out as more people arrived, I've got some bad news. There's a large military column approaching from the east. Looks like at least 100 cavalry, maybe more. They're flying a flag I don't recognize, and they're moving fast.
How far out are they?
Sheriff Davis called.
Maybe 3 hours, Henderson replied. They'll be here well before dark. A murmur of fear and confusion ran through the crowd. Esperanza was used to occasional visits from small cavalry patrols, but a force of this size suggested something far more serious than routine border security. What do they want? Someone shouted from the crowd.
I don't know, Henderson admitted.
But I think we need to prepare for the possibility that they're not here on a friendly visit. Marshal Garrett stepped forward, his face grim with the realization that his investigation had been overtaken by events far beyond his control. People of Esperanza, he called out in his official voice, I am Marshal Garrett from the territorial government. The military force approaching your town is under the command of Colonel Harrison, and they are here to investigate reports of collaboration between this community and hostile Apache forces. The crowd erupted in angry voices and frightened questions. Marshal Garrett raised his hand for silence and continued. I strongly advise anyone who has information about contact with Apache forces to come forward immediately.
Colonel Harrison is not known for his patience with civilian populations that he suspects of disloyalty.
What's that supposed to mean?
Big Pete Morrison demanded. Are you saying the army is coming here to attack us?
Before Marshal Garrett could answer, James McKenna stepped forward. Pete, he said loudly enough for the entire crowd to hear, the army is coming here to make an example. They're going to destroy this town and everyone in it unless we can convince them that Esperanza is not a threat to their operations.
And how exactly are we supposed to do that?
Martha Williams asked. James looked around at the faces of his neighbors, seeing fear, confusion, and the beginning of panic.
These were good people who had never hurt anyone, and they were about to be caught in the middle of a war they didn't understand and hadn't asked for. By giving them what they want, he said quietly. The words hung in the air for a moment before Sheriff Davis understood their meaning. No, Davis said firmly. We're not turning anyone over to Harrison. That's not how we do things in Esperanza. Sheriff, James replied, if Harrison finds me here, he'll assume the entire town has been working with me. He'll burn every building, kill every man, and probably take the women and children as prisoners to be relocated. Is that really what you want to happen to these people? Before Davis could respond, Windrunner stepped out of the crowd where he had been standing quietly in the shadow of a building. His sudden appearance caused several townspeople to gasp and reach for weapons, but James quickly held up a hand to prevent any violence. Wait, James said. Let him speak. Windrunner looked around at the gathering of white faces, most of which showed fear and hostility toward his presence. When he spoke, it was again in his careful English, but this time his words were directed at the entire crowd. Colonel Harrison kills Apache because he fears Apache, the scout said simply. He kills white people who help Apache because he fears white people who are not afraid of Apache. Fear makes him dangerous to everyone. What are you suggesting? Mayor Henderson asked nervously. Windrunner turned to James and spoke rapidly in Apache. James listened, his expression growing thoughtful, and then he asked several questions in the same language. The conversation continued for several minutes while the crowd watched nervously, unable to understand what was being discussed but sensing that their fate might depend on the outcome. Finally, James turned back to face the crowd. Windrunner has made a proposal, he said. It's dangerous, and it requires trust between people who have never had reason to trust each other. But it might be the only way to save this town. What kind of proposal? Sheriff Davis asked. The Apache know this country better than anyone. They know places to hide, places where even Harrison's cavalry can't follow. Windrunner says his people are willing to help evacuate Esperanza's citizens to safety in the mountains. In exchange for what? Marshal Garrett demanded suspiciously. In exchange for James McKenna, Windrunner said, speaking directly to the marshal. Apache take people to safety. James McKenna stays to face Soldier Chief. The crowd erupted in arguments and shouted questions. The idea of trusting their lives to Apache warriors was almost unthinkable for most of the townspeople, but the alternative of facing Colonel Harrison's expedition was equally terrifying. Absolutely not, Sheriff Davis said firmly. We don't abandon our own people, and we don't make deals with. He caught himself before finishing the sentence, realizing that his usual words would be deeply insulting to the Apache scout who was trying to help them. Sheriff, James said quietly, Windrunner is offering to save the lives of everyone in this town. All he's asking in return is that I stay behind to take responsibility for my own actions. That seems like a fair trade to me. It's not fair to anyone, Martha Williams declared, stepping forward to stand beside James. You saved Billy Henderson. You've helped everyone in this town at one time or another. We don't throw people to the wolves just because it's convenient. Mrs. Williams, James replied gently, those wolves are coming whether I'm here or not. The only question is how many people they kill when they arrive. The debate was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Not the measured pace of a large military column, but the urgent gallop of a single horse ridden hard. A moment later, young Tommy Patterson came racing into town on his father's horse, shouting at the top of his lungs. They're coming. The soldiers are coming. They're maybe an hour out and they're flying battle flags. The news hit the crowd like a physical blow. An hour wasn't enough time to evacuate the town, even if they had somewhere to go. It certainly wasn't enough time to organize the kind of evacuation that Windrunner had proposed, especially given how much most of the townspeople distrusted the idea of depending on Apache help. James looked around at the frightened faces of his neighbors and made a decision that he knew would change everything. Windrunner, he said in Apache, tell your war leader that James McKenna requests a meeting under the old agreements. Tell him that the time has come to honor the debts between us. Windrunner's eyes widened with surprise. He asked a quick question in Apache, and James nodded gravely.
Tell him," James continued in Apache, "that I am calling in the promise of 77 warriors." The scout stared at James for a long moment, then nodded and leaped onto his horse. Within seconds, he was galloping west toward the hills, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a town full of people who had no idea what James McKenna had just set in motion.
"What did you tell him?" Sheriff Davis demanded.
"I told him to bring help," James replied simply.
"The kind of help that might even the odds against Harrison's expedition." "What kind of help could possibly even odds against 200 cavalry?"
James looked toward the western hills where Windrunner had disappeared, and, for the first time since Marshal Garrett had arrived in Esperanza, he smiled. "The kind that Harrison has been having nightmares about for the past 3 years," he said. "The kind that might teach him that there are some towns in this territory that are under the protection of forces he can intimidate with uniforms and battle flags." In the distance, the dust cloud marking Colonel Harrison's approach was growing larger and more distinct. But, from the western hills, smoke signals were beginning to rise in patterns that would soon summon warriors from camps scattered across hundreds of square miles of desert and mountain terrain. The battle for Esperanza was about to begin, and neither side would emerge unchanged from what was to come. The smoke signals that rose from the hills west of Esperanza were visible for miles across the desert, carrying messages in a code that had been used by Apache bands for generations. To Colonel Harrison's scouts, riding ahead of the main cavalry column, the signals looked like nothing more than cook fires or perhaps brush being burned by careless herders. But, to the Apache warriors scattered across the territory, each spiral of smoke conveyed specific information about numbers, locations, and the urgent need for immediate action. Windrunner's horse was lathered with sweat by the time he reached the first Apache camp, hidden in a canyon that white men had ridden past 100 times without ever suspecting its existence. The camp consisted of only 12 warriors, but they were led by a man whose reputation extended far beyond the boundaries of Apache territory. Nailnish, the same warrior who had greeted James McKenna with such respect during Billy Henderson's rescue, listened carefully as Windrunner delivered his message. When the scout finished speaking, Nailnish sat in silence for several minutes, considering the implications of what he had heard. "Shash Yazi calls for the promise of 77 warriors," Nailnish finally said, speaking to the men gathered around him. "This is not a request made lightly."
"The white soldier chief brings many guns," one of the younger warriors pointed out. "Even 77 Apache cannot fight 200 cavalry in open battle." "Who spoke of open battle?"
Nailnish replied with a slight smile. "The Apache way is not to fight where the enemy is strongest, but to fight where the enemy is weakest. And all enemies are weakest when they do not understand what they are fighting." An older warrior named Grey Wolf spoke up from his position near the fire. "Nailnish, Shash Yazi earned our respect when he chose to protect Apache children rather than follow the orders of his war chief. But, asking us to fight other white men for the sake of a white town, this is something different."
"Is it?" Nailnish asked. "When white soldiers came to our villages, did Shash Yazi help them or did he stand against them? When we were hungry and had no weapons to hunt, who brought us ammunition and food? When our children were sick, who rode 3 days through enemy territory to bring medicine from the white settlements?" The warriors around the fire murmured their acknowledgement of these facts. James McKenna had indeed proven his loyalty to the Apache people through actions that had required considerable courage and sacrifice. But, the current situation was far more complex than helping individual bands with supplies or medical assistance. "The soldier chief Harrison has killed many of our people," Windrunner added. "He burns our homes and makes war on our families. If he destroys the town of Shash Yazi, he will grow stronger and more dangerous to all Apache." "And if we help Shash Yazi fight Harrison," Grey Wolf countered, "we will bring the anger of all white soldiers down upon our own families." Nailnish stood and walked to the edge of the canyon, looking out toward the desert where the dust cloud of Harrison's column was barely visible in the distance. When he turned back to face his warriors, his expression was grave but determined. "My brothers," he said formally, 5 years ago, Shash Yazi faced a choice between his duty to white soldiers and his duty to Apache children. He chose to protect the children, even though it meant sacrificing his place among his own people. Today, we face the same choice. We can protect only ourselves and hope that Harrison's anger does not reach us,
or we can stand with the one white man who has proven himself worthy of Apache brotherhood."
"What do you counsel?" asked a warrior named Quickstrike. "I counsel that we honor our debts," Nailnish replied. "Not because Shashyazi is white, but because he has shown himself to be a man of honor.
And not because we love the white town, but because destroying Harrison will protect Apache families for years to come." The debate that followed was conducted according to Apache tradition, with each warrior given the opportunity to speak his mind without interruption.
Some argued that involvement in white conflicts was not the Apache way.
Others pointed out that Harrison's campaigns had made conflict unavoidable, and that choosing the time and place of that conflict was preferable to waiting for Harrison to bring it to Apache territory on his own terms. As the discussion continued, other Apache arrived at the camp. Word of James McKenna's call for help had spread quickly through the network of signals and messengers that connected Apache bands across hundreds of miles of desert and mountain terrain. Within 2 hours of Wind Runner's arrival, representatives from 6 different bands had gathered in the hidden canyon.
Each new arrival brought the same message: their war leaders were willing to honor the promise made to Shashyazi, but they wanted to hear the plan before committing their warriors to what could easily become a disaster for all Apache people.
Nailnish understood their concerns. What James McKenna was asking for had never been attempted before. No white settlement had ever been defended by Apache warriors, and no Apache force had ever deliberately engaged the U.S. Army in defense of white civilians. The precedent they would set could have far-reaching consequences for Apache relations with both the military and civilian authorities. But, as the afternoon wore on and reports arrived about Harrison's approach, it became clear that this was not a decision that could be postponed indefinitely. The colonel's column was making better time than expected, and if Apache help was going to make any difference, it would have to be organized quickly. The final decision came from an unexpected source. As the Apache leaders debated the wisdom of honoring their commitment to James McKenna, a lone rider approached the canyon from the south. The scouts who challenged him returned with surprising news. The rider was an elderly Apache woman named Many Horses, who was revered among the bands as a keeper of tribal memory and wisdom. Many Horses rarely left her own territory, and her presence at the emergency gathering was seen by all the warriors as significant. When she spoke, even the most senior war leaders listened with respectful attention. "My sons," she said, settling herself near the fire with the careful movements of someone whose joints had endured many harsh winters, "you debate whether to help one white man defend one white town. But you think too small."
"What do you mean, grandmother?"
Nailnish asked, using the term of respect appropriate for a woman of her standing.
"Harrison is not just another white soldier chief," Many Horses replied. "He is the white soldier chief who believes that all Apache must die for white people to be safe in this land. If he succeeds in destroying everyone who shows mercy to Apache, then no white person will dare to help us in the future." The warriors around the fire exchanged glances, beginning to understand the larger implications of what the old woman was saying. "Shashyazi is not the only white person who has shown kindness to Apache people," Many Horses continued. "There are traders who deal fairly with us, ranchers who do not shoot Apache on sight, even soldiers who treat Apache prisoners with respect. If Harrison makes examples of towns like Esperanza, all of these people will be too frightened to maintain friendship with Apache." "So you believe we should fight for the white town?" asked Grey Wolf.
"I believe we should fight to preserve the possibility of peace," Many Horses replied. "There will always be white people who hate Apache, just as there will always be Apache who hate white people. But there are also those on both sides who seek understanding. These people are precious, and they must be protected." Her words carried the weight of accumulated wisdom and the authority of someone who had witnessed decades of conflict between Apache and white populations. The younger warriors who had been most skeptical of James McKenna's request began to reconsider their positions.
"If we fight for Shashyazi," Quickstrike asked, "how do we fight?"
"Harrison has more men, better weapons, and horses that can travel faster than Apache ponies."
"We fight as Apache have always fought," Nailnish answered. "We use the land itself as our ally.
We strike where the enemy does not expect, and we disappear before he can respond. We make him afraid of shadows and suspicious of every rock and tree."
"And if we win?" another warrior asked. "What happens when more soldiers come seeking revenge?"
If we win correctly, many horses said with a smile that held little humor, the story will be told that Colonel Harrison was defeated by the people of Esperanza themselves, with perhaps some help from friendly Apache. The white authorities will not send more soldiers to avenge a defeat that they believe was caused by their own mistakes. As the sun began to set behind the western mountains, the Apache leaders reached their decision. Word would be sent to the scattered bands, calling for volunteers to honor the promise made to Shashyazi. The response would not be mandatory, each warrior would be free to participate or not according to his own judgment. But those who chose to fight would do so under the leadership of Nailnish, with the blessing of many horses and the full understanding that they were fighting not just for one white town, but for the possibility of a future in which Apache and white people might coexist without constant warfare. By midnight, the first groups of Apache warriors had begun moving toward Esperanza. They traveled by routes known only to themselves, across terrain that white men considered impassable, using methods of concealment that made them invisible even to experienced trackers. Each group was small enough to move quickly and quietly, but together they would constitute a force that Harrison's expedition was completely unprepared to face. Meanwhile, in Esperanza, the townspeople spent a sleepless night preparing for what many of them believed would be their last dawn. Those who chose to evacuate had already departed for the mountains, guided by Apache scouts who materialized out of the darkness like spirits and led them to safety along paths that seemed to wind through solid rock. But a significant number of Esperanza's citizens had chosen to stay, whether out of stubborn loyalty to their homes, faith in James McKenna's mysterious plans, or simple inability to believe that American soldiers would actually attack an American town. Sheriff Davis spent the night organizing defensive positions and checking weapons, though he harbored no illusions about the town's ability to resist a determined cavalry assault. Marshal Garrett had finally taken James's advice and departed with his men, but not before grudgingly admitting that he hoped the town would somehow survive what was coming. James McKenna himself seemed strangely calm as the hours passed. He moved through the town helping with preparations, offering quiet words of encouragement to frightened families, and occasionally disappearing for brief periods to meet with Apache messengers who appeared and vanished like ghosts. "Do you really think your Apache friends can help us?" Sheriff Davis asked during one of these quiet interludes. "I mean no disrespect, but Harrison has 200 trained cavalrymen. Even if every Apache in the territory showed up, they'd still be outnumbered." "Sheriff," James replied, "you're thinking like a white soldier. You're thinking about numbers and firepower and direct confrontation. But that's not how the Apache fight, and it's not how we're going to win this." "Then, how are we going to win?" "By making Harrison fight the battle we choose instead of the battle he wants. By using his own assumptions and prejudices against him. By showing him that some things in this territory are more dangerous than he realizes." Before Davis could ask for more details, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the pre-dawn darkness. But these were not the measured hoofbeats of cavalry mounts. These were the lighter, faster sounds of Apache ponies, ridden by men who had learned to move across the desert without making unnecessary noise. James walked out to meet the new arrivals, and Sheriff Davis followed close behind. What he saw emerging from the darkness was like something from a fever dream: Apache warriors, armed and painted for war, greeting James McKenna with the respect and affection usually reserved for blood relatives. The leader of this group was Nailnish, though Sheriff Davis didn't recognize him from their brief encounter during Billy Henderson's rescue. In war paint and traditional Apache fighting gear, Nailnish looked like an entirely different person from the calm negotiator who had spoken with James in the desert. "Shashyazi," Nailnish said in English, clearly for the benefit of the white men who were watching. "You called, and we have come." "How many?" James asked, speaking Apache but gesturing in a way that made his meaning clear to the watching townspeople. 77 warriors, as promised," Nailnish replied. "They are positioned in the hills around this town. When the white soldier chief arrives, he will find himself surrounded, though he will not know it until we choose to reveal ourselves." Sheriff Davis felt his jaw drop. 77 Apache warriors, positioned around Esperanza without him having noticed their arrival, ready to fight against American cavalry in defense of a white settlement. It was beyond anything he could have imagined when he first pinned on his sheriff's badge. "What's the plan?" James asked. The plan is to teach Colonel Harrison that there are consequences for making war on people who are under Apache protection, Nailnish replied.
The plan is to show him that his methods create enemies where none existed before.
The plan is to make him understand that true strength comes not from destroying everything different from yourself, but from building alliances with those who share your values. As the first light of dawn began to brighten the eastern sky, the lookouts posted on the hills around Esperanza signaled that Harrison's column was approaching. The colonel had timed his arrival to coincide with sunrise, probably hoping to catch the town off guard and unprepared. What he would find instead was a settlement that had been transformed overnight into something unprecedented in the history of the American frontier, a white town defended by Apache warriors, where the old rules of racial conflict no longer applied and the consequences of aggression would be swift, decisive, and completely unexpected. James McKenna checked his weapons one final time and looked out toward the approaching dust cloud that marked Harrison's advance. After 5 years of hiding from his past, he was about to face it directly. But, this time, he would not be alone, and, this time, the outcome would be very different from what anyone expected. Colonel Marcus Harrison had built his military reputation on the principle that overwhelming force, applied swiftly and, without mercy, was the only language that savage peoples understood. As his column of 200 cavalry approached Esperanza in the early morning light, he felt the familiar surge of confidence that came from commanding superior numbers and firepower against what he expected would be minimal resistance. The colonel had received detailed reports about the town's suspected Apache sympathies, and he had developed what he considered to be a perfectly appropriate response. Esperanza would serve as an object lesson to other frontier communities about the consequences of consorting with hostile Indians. By the end of the day, the town would be a smoking ruin, and word of its destruction would spread throughout the territory as a warning to anyone else who might be tempted to show mercy to Apache raiders. What Harrison did not know was that his column had been under observation for the past 10 hours by Apache scouts who were tracking every movement, counting every horse and rider, and reporting their findings to warriors positioned throughout the hills surrounding Esperanza. The colonel's confidence in his overwhelming superiority was based on intelligence that was 3 days old and fatally incomplete.
The first sign that something was different came when Harrison's advance scouts returned with news that confused and concerned the colonel.
Instead of the panicked evacuation he had expected to find, Esperanza appeared to be going about its normal business. Smoke was rising from chimneys, people were moving through the streets, and there were no signs of the frantic preparation that usually accompanied news of an approaching military expedition.
"Are you certain about what you saw?"
Harrison demanded of his chief scout, a grizzled veteran named Sergeant Mills who had been tracking Apache for more years than he cared to remember.
"Yes, sir," Mills replied. "The town looks normal. Peaceful, even. Like they don't know we're coming or don't care."
"That's impossible. Our intelligence indicated that Marshal Garrett's investigation had created significant unrest in the community.
They should be either preparing to resist or preparing to flee." "Well, sir, they're not doing either one. Unless it's some kind of trap."
The possibility of a trap had occurred to Harrison, but he dismissed it almost immediately.
What kind of trap could a frontier town with maybe 50 armed men possibly set for 200 experienced cavalry?
The idea was absurd.
"We'll proceed as planned," Harrison decided. "Deploy the men in standard formation for pacification operations.
I want the town surrounded with clear fields of fire in all directions.
Any resistance will be crushed immediately."
As Harrison's cavalry moved into position around Esperanza, they remained completely unaware that they were being watched by eyes that had been studying cavalry tactics for generations. Apache warriors lay hidden in rocky outcroppings that provided perfect concealment while offering clear views of every military movement. Other warriors had positioned themselves in arroyos and washes that would allow them to strike at the cavalry's flanks without warning. The arrangement was not random. Nailnish had spent years observing how white soldiers fought, and he had developed tactics specifically designed to exploit their weaknesses. White cavalry was formidable in open terrain where their superior firepower and mobility could be brought to bear, but it became vulnerable when forced to fight in broken country where individual marksmanship and knowledge of the terrain mattered more than disciplined formations.
James McKenna stood in the center of Esperanza's main street, watching Harrison's men take their positions.
Beside him, Sheriff Davis fidgeted nervously with his rifle, while Mayor Henderson tried to project an air of calm authority despite the obvious fear in his eyes. The remaining townspeople had taken cover in buildings and behind barricades, but they had not fled, and they had not raised white flags of surrender. "Remember," James said quietly to the men standing with him, "let me do the talking when Harrison arrives. No matter what he says or what threats he makes, don't respond. Your job is to stay calm and let him reveal his intentions to everyone watching."
"What if he just orders his men to start shooting?" Sheriff Davis asked.
"Then, we'll find out whether my Apache friends are as good as I think they are," James replied.
The answer came sooner than expected.
Colonel Harrison, frustrated by the town's apparent lack of proper fear and submission, decided to make his intentions clear through a demonstration of military power. He ordered a squad of cavalry to charge through the main street, firing their weapons in the air and shouting threats about what would happen to Apache sympathizers. It was exactly the kind of aggressive display that Apache warriors had been waiting for. The charging cavalry had made it perhaps 50 yards into the town when the first shots rang out from the surrounding hills. But these were not random shots fired by frightened civilians. These were carefully aimed rifle bullets delivered by expert marksmen who could drop a running deer at 300 yards.
Within seconds, 6 cavalry horses were down and their riders were scrambling for cover, suddenly aware that they were under attack from positions they couldn't even see.
The demonstration charge became a panicked retreat as the surviving cavalrymen realized they had ridden into a carefully prepared ambush.
Colonel Harrison's reaction was immediate and predictable.
Enraged by this unexpected resistance, he ordered his bugler to sound the attack and prepared to overwhelm the town with the full force of his expedition.
"Deploy by companies," Harrison shouted.
"I want this entire settlement burned to the ground.
Anyone who fires on United States cavalry is a traitor and will be treated accordingly." But, as Harrison's men moved to execute his orders, they discovered that their tactical situation was far more complex than their commander had anticipated.
The hills around Esperanza erupted with Apache war cries and rifle fire, as 77 warriors revealed their positions simultaneously and began a coordinated attack on the cavalry's flanks and rear. What had appeared to be a simple punitive expedition against a defenseless frontier town had suddenly become a pitched battle against experienced Apache fighters who knew every rock and gully in the surrounding terrain. Harrison's cavalry found themselves caught in crossfire from positions that seemed impossible to assault and difficult even to locate precisely.
"Sir,"
Sergeant Mills called out over the sound of gunfire, "we're taking heavy casualties.
The Apache have us surrounded." Harrison stared in disbelief at the chaos erupting around him. This was not supposed to happen.
Apache rarely stood and fought against cavalry in organized formations. They were supposed to be hit-and-run raiders who avoided direct confrontation with superior forces.
How?